Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology. We are back from our summer recess, and we are kicking off this fall with an incredible lineup of guests. First up on the show, we have Morgan Schneller. She's a certified nutritionist, writer, educator, and founder of WellBiome, a nutrition consultation practice that prioritizes individual customized nutrition plans. Morgan's studies span across the fields of functional medicine, microbiology, immunology, and therapeutic diets. She holds a master's degree in nutrition and completed an internship in primary care functional medicine, where she studied under mentors at the top of their field in immunology, microbiology, and neuroscience. It's so great to have you on this show, Morgan. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Cassandra.
Yeah. So, why don't we start with some of the basics? What can you share with us about autoimmunity and how that kind of intersects with diet?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's sort of a little bit of a hurdle when dealing with clients with autoimmunity is getting them to understand how a condition that potentially is not necessarily in the GI, autoimmunity affects a range of different systems, has anything to do with their gut or what they're eating. Um, and I think one of the nice ways to kind of place it is thinking about the fact that, 70 to 80% of our immune system is actually in the GI. So that places us, right, understanding that what we're eating is having an impact on our immune system and our immune response. And again, these autoimmune conditions, there's, over 80 recognized autoimmune conditions. That number is increasing. It's 4.5% of the world population, as many as 50 million Americans. And it affects, again, this range of different tissues throughout the body. So in my work and dealing with nutrition and autoimmune diseases, it's important to think about how these two go together and how I can be most effective at sort of intervening or supporting them with the right or most appropriate nutrition interventions.
That's great. Well, and I'm wondering maybe it would help our audience too if you can give us some examples of what is an autoimmune disease. This is basically where your body attacks itself. Is that right? And what are some examples?
Yeah, so it's a misguided immune response that often involves inflammatory immune mediators. So basically, what that means is that it's a manifestation of immune dysregulation. So there's a difference between autoimmunity and autoimmune disease. Autoimmunity is the presence of these self reactive B cells or T cells. And then autoimmune disease is when that develops into a pathological or functional damage to the organ or tissues containing that target autoantibody. So, sorry, autoantigen. So, it yeah, it's this mistaken or immune dysregulation that happens when there's sort of a cascade of reasons why. There's a lot of contributing risk factors, different things like genetics, environment, lifestyle that can all contribute, and they can lead to, right, this dysregulation or this dysfunction in the immune system where it's sort of misfiring and pointing its let's say, target right in the wrong direction.
So, when one thinks about autoimmunity, are there certain uh, indications that you're possibly at risk for autoimmune disease or, um, like, what does this really look like, for people? And I know it probably looks very different depending on the different types of reactions that we're talking about.
Yeah, so there can be different genetic predispositions. Like family history is obviously a huge one. If there's other family members, within your certainly immediate family unit that have a history of autoimmunity, you might have an increased chance of developing it. There can also be genetic risk factors for, increased intestinal permeability. I'm sure that's something that we'll continue to talk about, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then epigenetic factors as well that can be kind of turned on as life goes, as someone progresses through life by certain, environmental triggers. So this can be things like infectious disease, certain medication use like antibiotics or certain antidepressants that can disturb the microbiome, exposure to different toxins, heavy metals, things like that. They've been sort of tracking a little bit of an increase or this potential increase in autoimmunity post COVID. That's something that's coming out a lot in the science and the research now. And then, of course, different lifestyle factors like nutrition, right? What we're eating, how we're living, sedentary lifestyle. If people are undergoing chronic stress and poor sleep, stress is a big one in terms of chronic stress. So, an ongoing exposure to stress, like we have a certain tolerance for stress. Of course, all of us are going to be a little bit different. But when you see a chronic stress, you start to see um, changes to the immune system. And if you have those other sets or those other markers, those other genetic predispositions already underlying, and then you introduce something like chronic stress, or you introduce something like a sedentary lifestyle or poor nutrition, then your likelihood of developing or moving to an autoimmune diagnosis, there's a potential for that to increase. So that's where, on the other side of the coin, if we're thinking about clients that we're potentially working with, if someone comes in and they have sort of the cards stacked against them to say, we want to be really proactive in the way that we're looking at preventative medicine for them and making sure that we are giving them the tools to manage stress, to keep their movement, to, prioritize their sleep, to make sure that they're getting the right nutrients and the right, combination of foods in their system to protect them as much as possible against developing something like this.
That's great. I think this all kind of falls under this umbrella of many diseases, few causes, right? Where you have um, risk factors with inflammation, with oxidative stress, exposure to environmental toxicants, all these things that can drive us more and more toward this pro inflammatory state. So, we're talking about the gut today, and we've had previous guests speak a bit about the gut brain axis and the communication pathways kind of between our gut microbiota and their ability to look at certain neuroreceptors. And for the listeners out there that are new to the show, I'd encourage you to check out an older episode with Dr. Vanessa Speridiano and her work on addiction in the gut brain axis. But today we're talking about the gut immune axis. And so maybe you could elaborate a bit more about that and what role does immunity play in the gut, and kind of what are some of the major protective barriers the gut presents for our bodies?
Yeah, and just to sort of, start off that conversation, I'll also point people back to your episode with Dr. Heather Zwicky because she was my mentor and who I learned
Yes.
a lot from. So I'm sure I'm going to be echoing a lot of the things that was covered in that episode as well because I learned from her. So my
Yeah.
knowledge has come from her. Um, but one of the things that I don't think that people necessarily realize is that when we get into, the large intestine, the intestinal barrier is only a cell thick. So it's there's reasons for it to be, both protective and permeable because we want certain nutrients to be able to come in and we want to have a barrier that protects us as well. So let me just back up a little bit, right? The gut itself and the gut microbiome is impacting not only the local immune response, but also systemic immunity. So it's impacting us beyond the GI. And the gut microbiome itself is impacting both the innate, so the general immune response, and then also the adaptive or the specific immune response. And again, because 70 or 80% of the immune cells are present in the gut, there's a lot of activity going on in there. A lot of the times they'll use this visualization of like a donut to say, basically this thing that's moving through the entire center of our body, right? Our intestinal tract. We're drawing in things from the outside. So there's a huge exposure. So we want to have our immune system sort of stacked where that large exposure is. Um, but then there becomes this, interplay between the intestinal microbiota, the epithelial layer, the local mucosal immune system, and then how nutrition sort of impacts the composition of the gut microbiome and the immune system. Um, and really sort of highlights the importance of the GI and the importance of maintaining the health of the GI and the health of that intestinal barrier, right? We're talking about like the intestinal barrier and the integrity of that to make sure that we are maintaining sort of intended the intended role of that barrier, which is to be protective against the things we don't want to come in and then allowing the things we do want to come in, allowing the nutrients, allowing, the hydration we want to come in, but not allowing any of the pathogenic or non-beneficial bacteria to sort of permeate that barrier.
Well, that's great. And I'm wondering if maybe we could paint a picture. I'm big into visualization. So I'm like, maybe it'd help also our audience to think about like what does it look like inside of our gut? Like what are you actually seeing? You have, for example, and I don't know if we should try to do this with the small intestine probably or the large intestine, but you have microbiota, you have fiber and the food materials you're eating. And then what that's kind of in the middle, but that also how deeply do those microbiota go into our kind of gut wall and what's the role of mucosa and what's happening on these layers? Maybe you could kind of illustrate
Yeah.
a picture of what it looks like in the inside.
So the mucosal barrier is very important. Um, okay, so we have the microbiota. We have the food passing through the intestinal tract, right? That's coming through like a train. You could do a train in a tunnel, I guess. That's a good visualization, right? Then we have the microbiota sort of on the sides of that tunnel. And then sort of imagine say the tunnel was like lined with moss, right? That would be the mucosal barrier. And then the tunnel itself is the one cell layer thick. And outside of that, on the other side, is all the immune mediators. And sometimes some of them will have like little arms that will reach through the tunnel because they're sort of surveying the landscape and seeing what's going on. And then on the inside, right, some of the microbiome and some of the microbiota have deeper root systems into that moss. So that depends on lots of things. It depends on the type of species it is. It depends on how long it's been there. It depends on how well established it is. It depends on if it's part of a live microorganism probiotic that you've taken that's sort of just passing through with the train. It's sort of like a passenger through, or whether it's something that you've cultivated over a lifetime and it has a really deep root system that's sort of anchored into this moss or this mucosal barrier. So everyone is completely different, right? That's sort of a general overlay of the landscape of what that looks like. But what I can say about the mucosal barrier and the relationship between that and the microbiota is that it's sort of, like I said, it's sort of where it anchors a bit, but it also can be a food source if we don't have enough that's coming in on the train itself in the way of fiber and beneficial food that is feeding the microbiota. Then the microbiota turns to the mucosal barrier and starts to actually ingest that. And that we don't want because as that mucosal barrier gets thinner and thinner, then we start to get exposure to the intestinal epithelial, cell lining of the intestines themselves, which is where we could start to see intestinal permeability and et cetera. Because the mucosal barrier gets thinner, there's less protection. So we want to make sure that we're eating enough fiber and that we're eating enough of the right things so that the microbiome has enough food that it doesn't start to degrade that mucosal barrier, which then in turn will start to degrade the intestinal lining, you know, increase intestinal permeability, basically.
Ability. So when we talk about that was a beautiful illustration. I can imagine this little
Okay.
train. And I'm like, I'm wondering, okay, so now we're thinking about the mucosal barrier. What happens when there's dysbiosis or we're not feeding our microbiome what it needs to eat? Because by the way, when we're consuming foods, we're not just feeding our bodies, we're feeding all of our passengers on that train. Um, I guess when you talk about permeability of the gut, permeability is not a good thing in this scenario. And this is where we get into the topic of leaky gut. Is that right? What can you tell us about what are some of the consequences of having a leaky gut? What does that do in terms of this landscape of immunity?
Yeah. So autoimmunity, what we're talking about is the very quick answer. That's a potential consequence. Um, but when there is this damage to the gastrointestinal lining, it basically leads to an increase in space between the cells in the intestinal tract, which can lead to an alert for the immune system, which is on the other side, which leads to inflammation, right? And then we also know chronic inflammation over time is not good for us. It's basically the body is always trying to maintain a level of homeostasis. It's always trying to right the ship, essentially. So when there are these imbalances, and there's these alert systems our body is constantly trying to catch up and trying to make sure that everything continues to function, that everything stays how it's supposed to be going. And that damage, if we have it in the intestinal lining, right, that leaky gut or intestinal permeability, it's that damage, it then creating space for larger food particles, for bacteria, for potential pathogenic viruses that wouldn't otherwise be able to pass through. It's allowing them to pass through, which is then leading to an immune response. And that can be something localized, like that can be something like um, GI distress, constipation, um, diarrhea, bloating, you know, flatulence, gas, etc., food sensitivities, food intolerances, and then it can go, further to autoimmunity, to further to autoimmune disease, where it's then moving beyond the GI and going to something like, for example, in psoriasis, where it's affecting the skin. And you think, how could this possibly have come from my gut all the way to like my elbow? I don't understand, or my scalp, or whatever, right? Wherever you're having that psoriasis outbreak. So that's kind of in the beginning why I was talking about it's important to remember that these can be a systemic impact. It's not just localized to the GI. And it's often a difficult hurdle when dealing with clients to sort of get them on board to understanding, because it's not something that we've been taught, right? It's not certainly not something that my generation was taught in school, that what you eat can impact all these different components of your health. It was like more about what you eat as relative to weight and gaining weight or losing weight, but not necessarily like the full function of your body, and certainly not into mental health, which is like a whole nother component. But just to say that, you know, these that trying to explain sometimes that, what we're eating is impacting the GI, and then is impacting our immune system, and then is having a larger impact on our overall health and well-being. Um, I think is definitely what this conversation is about. Sometimes it's difficult for people to conceptualize that.
Yeah, I think that it is an interesting point how you can see something happening in a completely different organ system in the body and think they're completely unrelated when indeed, um, a lot of our diseases have origins in the diet.
Yeah, like if there's a
I
skin issue,
always
we might think, "Oh, I put a cream here," right?
Mhm.
Localized. But when we're thinking more of like functional, holistic, integrated medicine, we're trying to think about the root cause. Like, how did that even come to be? Where did that come from? What was the genesis of that? And then we're always, not always, but a lot of the times going back and looking at that.
Yeah. I always like to say we don't have a healthcare problem in the United States. We have a food problem in the United
Yeah.
States. And, let's talk a little bit about the SAD diet, the standard American diet, and what that means for gut barrier integrity, what that means for probability of risk for autoimmunity. Um, Maybe, yeah. I mean, you've got this amazing background in nutrition. Maybe you can elaborate a bit about what distinguishes the standard American diet from other diets, and how that affects our gut health.
Yeah. So the standard American diet, I mean, it's deficient in a lot of things. There's limited dietary diversity. Most people are not eating a variety of plants, vegetables, fruits, etc. So there's a large decrease in plant-based fiber sources. And, in the US, 60% of all the foods that we're consuming are ultra processed foods. So that sort of goes into a debate of what are we actually considering to be food, and a food product, and a food quality. I was thinking this morning a little bit about clients that I've had that have come in and are still very confused about gluten and what gluten is, and will ask like, "Oh, well, is there gluten in an apple?" And what that's illustrating to me is that we've really sort of lost our way on understanding what is food, right? Versus what is something that is ultra processed, or a component, or ingredients, or a plant. Like, apple is an apple is an apple is an apple. It's just an apple. There,
Yeah,
there's not gluten in it. And I'm glad that they're asking me these questions, and that allows me to go into an education component of it. But, the majority of what we're eating is, sugar, simple carbs, ultra refined, stripped of all nutrients. So when we're thinking about, okay, we want to make sure that we're having enough fiber, right, to feed these microbes so they're not then cannibalizing the mucosal barrier. people are eating things that don't have fiber. You know, the standard American diet has about 15 grams of fiber per day. The FDA recommendation is between 28 and 40 grams of fiber
Yeah.
per day. And then optimal is actually like 50 plus grams of fiber per day.
Wow.
So it's a huge, I mean, 15 standard American diet to we would ideally like to see somebody having more than 50. There, people are not, getting enough real food in their diets.
Yeah. This is where I think a lot of food marketing throws people off. It gets us confused. I mean, and it, in a way, I can understand why someone would ask if there's gluten, which by the way is a wheat product. What, if there's gluten in an apple, because you can see, all types of labels in the stores on, processed foods or just regular food. You see like rice, gluten free rice. Well, I would hope so. If it's
Yeah.
actually rice, it should be gluten free, and so it's confusing. I think we also have confusion around some of these health trends. A lot of people still practice juicing to increase their intake of plant molecules, but what you're really doing when you juice is also removing all of that fiber. So you're getting all the delicious sweet parts of the food. And a lot of those, excellent antioxidants, but you're ripping out the fiber, which is, a big part of what makes something like an apple a healthy food. Um, so when you meet with clients that are really just, I think, at that early stage of understanding, how do I foster a healthier gut that is going to play better with my immune system? What are some of the standard across the board pieces of advice? I know that everyone has a different physiology, everyone has a different dietary needs, but are there some commonalities that you do find are relevant to anyone?
Yeah, one of the big things that I like to implement is symptom tracking over time, especially because everybody is unique and individualized. Um, I like to make sure that people are, or it also helps them to sort of get more in touch with their body and what's actually happening because a lot of the times people will come in and not even realize how many symptoms that they have because they've sort of accrued over time. And so their fatigue, they contribute to, you know, work stress. But then they eliminate something like gluten, for example, and they're sleeping better and they're not as tired anymore. And they were like, I didn't even know that those things would potentially be related. So tracking is a big one. I think as far as like generalized tips, a lot of it is about, shopping the perimeter of the grocery store. So making sure that you're filling up the grocery cart first with those foods, like the food products that are actually food, plants, vegetables, right? Plant-based fiber, nuts, seeds, legumes, etc. Um, Shopping local farmers markets if that's accessible to you, if you have them nearby, and just shopping for things that are not products, right? So you're shopping for produce versus products, not something that you can open up in a package, etc. And a lot of that too then kind of turns into again more teaching opportunities because a lot of times people don't know what to do. What do I do with a head of cabbage other than boil it? I don't know, right? What else can I make with this?
You can
Or
ferment it. It's my
yeah,
favorite thing to do.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, it doesn't necessarily, have to be complicated, but I think it can be overwhelming,
Yeah.
especially people are coming in with such busy lives and you're saying, "Oh, you have to learn this whole new skill," or a lot of the times, grocery shopping and shopping for food and going out to dinner is a bit in the automated part of our brain where it's something we don't have to think about anymore, which we're very grateful for. So then when people come in and they see a nutritionist and they say, okay, well, we're going to have to put some attention towards this and start to think about it. And it sort of can, can create like a little bit of a bluster, like, oh, well, it's a bit overwhelming and I think that's where, as far as how I like to work with people sort of ongoing over time, this collaborative approach to make sure that we're really working together. It's low and slow. Like one of the things I say, as far as, one of the big sort of takeaways that's come out over the last few years is about making sure to get in over 30 plants a week. So if I have a client come in and I tell them, okay, here's your takeaway. I want you to have 30 plants a week, and they're having like three, that's never going to happen. It's just like it's not possible for them. They don't know where to start, etc. So one of the things that I generally like to say is, okay, well, next time you go to the grocery store, I want you to buy a vegetable that you've never eaten before, and see what we can do with that, right? What can we make with that? How can we try it? How can we integrate it into your thing or try a different spice that they've never had before, a different herb, right? Herbal teas are like a great way to get different polyphenols and different antioxidants into their system that they may not have been exposed to. And it's relatively low um, energy investment as far as the time it takes to, boil water and put some herbs in a cup of tea.
Yeah, I think what we're dealing with across the board is this knowledge loss. It's really traditional knowledge of how to do what has always been kind of common sense work in the home of being able to cook or grow your own food. Um, just because of economic shifts that have occurred really in the United States, especially since the 1950s. Um, when you talk about shopping the perimeter, I think it's important to remind people too that, the frozen aisle section can actually have a lot of great fresh frozen fruit and vegetables that are going to be better than perhaps the canned aisle vegetables that are laden with salt. Um, what do you think about smoothies? I often get this question if I'm telling people not to juice, could they do smoothies at home as a way of getting more of those vegetables, more of those fruits?
Yes, I would say not instead of, but in addition to.
Okay.
So I still want them to eat warm foods and eat cooked foods. But yes, you can also have smoothies. I don't have an issue with that. I think, my background is in Ayurveda, yoga and Ayurveda as well. So there's a big component, especially when we're talking about GI health and whatnot, to have warming foods. So especially if someone is having some, issues, GI issues like constipation, et cetera, what we wouldn't necessarily recommend a lot of cold foods like cold water, cold smoothies, cold salads, raw foods. We would want them to have more warming, more grounding spices, things like that. So yeah, it's all relative and all depends on each unique individual person. I'm not like anti-smoothie though. I'm not really
Yeah.
even anti-juice. It just depends what it's in the context of, you know?
Yeah. What do you think about beans? I feel like beans are such a miracle food. I mean, beans as a we don't think maybe of beans as being an important vegetable, but um it looks like the evidence on beans, there are many different types of beans, is actually looking pretty good for our gut health. What do you think about
Yeah,
beans?
beans are great. I mean,
Yeah.
these are such funny questions because it's like, what do you think about smoothies? Great. Eat food, eat real food.
Eat it.
Do it.
Yeah.
Beans, legumes, etc. It's high protein, high fiber. They're finding a lot of
Mhm.
beans in like a lot of the blue zones and longevity diets that they're a big component of those like cultural and ancestral foods, especially because they're relatively inexpensive. So
Yeah.
I will say the caveat to that is if you're having people that have autoimmunity or they have high GI distress, beans can be more energy consumptive to eat and to break down. So if there is a lot of damage and GI damage that may cause distress, like it can cause, bloating or pain or etc., flatulence. Those are things I would want to be aware of. And so again, when we're talking about a community that has potentially like large GI damage, like an autoimmune community, legumes might not be the first thing that I would introduce. It's something that I would introduce preventatively. If someone has no symptoms and they have a family history, I would say, let's get a lot of fiber into your diet as long as they're not having symptoms with it. If they're having symptoms with it, then we might want to look at, okay, what's going on underneath this? How is your intestinal permeability, right? How is your mucosal system? What does the ecosystem of your microbiome look like? Do we have enough of the beneficial bacteria in there to make sure that we're able to break down? Because as I said, they are fiber rich and a complex carbohydrate, which is good for our microbiome. But if the beneficial bacteria are not there that can help to break down that particular type of food, it can be taxing for certain people. So beans are great. Not everyone can tolerate them. That requires, another conversation about how we're introducing them, how we're potentially reintroducing them if somebody's cut them out, if say they're on like a low FODMAP diet, say they're on, a paleo type diet, say they're on something that's been some kind of a restrictive diet, then we want to be careful about how we reintroduce them because likely that beneficial bacteria species that's specific to breaking down the legume or the bean may not be as robust in their microbiome as someone else who has been eating them their entire life and has that, community there that can help break those foods down.
That's great. Well, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, how how do we go about checking the status of our gut health? I have, my annual checkup coming up with my physician. Are there tests that she can run to determine, is my gut barrier integrity looking good? Or, how do we assess these things? Or are there methods or tools to assess the health of our gut?
Yeah, so there are certainly tests. There's a little bit of debate or controversy about the efficacy of these tests because one of the studies that I sort of like to look at is from 2018, and it was basically saying, well, the takeaway is that the microbiome is adaptive, it's shifting, it's resilient, and it's not a one size fits all. So you can potentially get a test that is looking at what are the bacteria that are present, right? You can get a printout of that. And then what are the metabolites that are present? So like what short chain fatty acids are you producing in your gut, et cetera. And that's a good sort of baseline, let's say, could potentially be a good baseline. I like to pair that with symptoms, right? So I like to look at, what are you personally experiencing, right? Like, are you having GI symptoms? Are you having skin rashes? Are you having headaches? Are you having mental health stuff go on? Are you having fatigue? Like, what else is going on that's going to lead me to think more about your intestinal health and GI health? But this particular study, essentially, why I'm kind of pairing it up with the test is because the test is giving you a printout of, okay, you have these species and they're producing these metabolites. But what this study looked at was the metabolites being produced on one side and then the species on the other side. And so what they found was that even in different people or in different samples where the species would shift, the metabolites being produced remained the same. So that is to
Hmm.
say that there is not a perfect map to say this is a healthy microbiome. Because as I was talking about before, like the body is trying to maintain homeostasis. So what they were noticing is that in these specific, strains of bacteria, even though they weren't present, the ones that were producing the beneficial microbes, and they had shifted a little bit and they were different species in there, those species had shifted to be able to produce the beneficial microbes. So those two, individuals or samples were still healthy, even though they didn't look the same. Right.
I
So to
bet you.
say if you take a test and it gives you a printout of, oh, you have XYZ species, there's, we can look at that and give a general, okay, this person should quote unquote be healthy. But if that person is experiencing multiple symptoms, they don't feel good, they have, a laundry list of things that they're bringing to the table to their physician, then that printout doesn't align with the symptoms and we need to ask more questions and look a little bit deeper about what is potentially actually going on here.
Got it. So, okay, so we can get an idea then based on basic idea based on these tests, but also a lot of it is based on symptoms. We've talked a bit about things that we need to foster a healthy gut with regards to fiber and variety, especially in vegetables and beans and um, these types of nutrients. But what are some of the things that you would say we might want to consider limiting in the diet because of their propensity for damage to the gut barrier? I know antibiotics are one, oral antibiotics can definitely disrupt the gut barrier and the gut microbiota. Are there other things that people consume? Like, I mean, would alcohol fall under that category as well? Like, yeah,
Yeah. So, as far as like the negative impacts of certain things we're intaking, it's important to understand that there's a certain amount of space in our GI that needs to be occupied. So, say we go into that space and we take an antibiotic that knocks out the beneficial bacteria. Those beneficial bacteria were essentially colonizing certain niches that would otherwise be taken up by non beneficial or pathogenic bacteria. So, if we're taking, so like, there's been studies on antibiotics, certainly antidepressants, things like metformin, GLP-1 is a little bit still out for debate, NSAIDs, et cetera, that can disrupt this balance in the microbiome. So, not necessarily food, right? But what we're intaking as far as medications. And then we can also think about things like, pesticides on our food, but also just exposure, general exposure, like to different, pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides in our environment for, playing in the grass that's been recently sprayed. If people are going to parks that have recently been sprayed, or individuals, children, et cetera, are playing on sport fields that are heavily sprayed. Like those are things we want to consider that are potentially downstream impacting the microbiome. Um, and then as far as foods, right, it's not that far of a jump to then think about ultra processed foods, foods that are highly sprayed, right? Foods that have low nutrient density or low nutritious value. And I'm sure you can speak a lot too about what's, sort of been happening as far as in farming and plants in general when we start to look at, the quality of the soil that they're being grown in. And if that soil is completely depleted, the soil is essentially akin to our microbiome. If that soil is depleted of microbes, then the plants that are growing in it are depleted of nutrients. And then we're eating something that isn't as nutrient dense as it potentially could be or used to be, right? So those ancestral microbiota species are dying out or disappearing. Um, So again, right, on the opposite of this, negative side is the positive impact, right? Where we can look at diversifying nutrients, like making sure we're getting those 30 plants, making sure we're getting as much fiber as we can and diversity of fiber. So not eating a ton of broccoli and only broccoli every week, but having, broccoli and kale and asparagus and lentils and, brown rice and all the different things combined. Like a lot of the times, when I'll make a meal, I try to think of like, okay, like what else is in the fridge that I can add to this? And maybe it's like a little bit of parsley, or maybe it's a little bit of turmeric, or maybe it's like, you know, pumpkin seeds or something that I can add to the top of something just so I have an additional plant in the meal. So that's really big. Exercise and movement is another one that has an impact, a beneficial impact on the microbiome. Being outdoors in green spaces and good spaces that, aren't heavily sprayed or laden with toxins. And then mindfulness and meditation is a huge one too, can have a beneficial impact on the microbiome. So as much as there are, things that can negatively impact, there are also things that can positively impact. And if we sort of lean heavier on focusing on that and kind of, quiet the noise on the negative things, because I feel like, again, it can be really overwhelming when we just sort of focus on everything that's bad and can potentially harm us. It's like, well, I don't know where to go from here. So if we focus on where we can
Yeah.
go and what we can do, I think it can be sometimes a little bit more uplifting. And a lot of times people like to focus on like, you know, what can I do to fix this? Like, how can I help this problem? And yeah, adding like a couple of pumpkin seeds onto your oatmeal. Great. That's something that you can do. It's an actionable item. It's not that big of it's not that heavy of a lift, but it can have huge beneficial downstream. And it sort of like gets the ball rolling in this positive direction.
What are your thoughts on lacto fermented foods? Because this is basically a way to consume, more probiotics in your diet outside of taking pills. I'm thinking of like fermented dairy, like yogurts and kefir, or lacto fermented vegetables, kimchi, sauerkraut, all these yummy pickles, like fermented pickles. Um, what are your thoughts on how those might help in terms of, you know, reduction in risk for autoimmunity, or are there any findings around that space?
Yeah. So the American Gut Project was who put out and was behind sort of funding the 30 plants per week. And that was a
Mhm.
huge study. And then after that study, basically, the Sonnenbergs, which are very well known um, studiers of the microbiome at Stanford, said, okay, well, let's look at this and see if we can notice a difference between having a high fiber plant based diet and the incorporation of fermented food into the diet. What does that look like? What is the difference between these two things? So they looked at the high fiber diet and they saw this is great for you, right? There's changes in the microbiome, there's changes in the short chain fatty acids, there's a personalized immune response that's beneficial. So great things. Then they said, okay, and compared to people that are eating at least 3 different types of fermented foods per week, they're seeing an increase, like a notable significant increase in the microbiome diversity, notable decreased markers of inflammation.
Mhm.
And, when we're talking about inflammation and we're talking about autoimmunity, that's huge because with autoimmunity, inflammation is large, right? And inflammation is a component of the immune response. So, once again, this isn't like, okay, you don't have to have all the fiber and you can have the fermented foods. It's like, think about if you combined these interventions, right? And then you were able to,
Yeah.
individualize them to yield the most effective results. So, not everybody loves, kimchi. Can they have sauerkraut? Right? Can they have
Mhm.
yogurt? Can they have some kombucha? Can they have a different kind of fermented food and still see benefits? Absolutely. Right? And again, it's not like one or the other, but how do all these things work in a layered modality to yield the most effective results? And I think that's kind of one of the things that we had talked about at the beginning too, especially in autoimmunity. It's not, you know, one trigger and one result. Most of the times in autoimmunity and in autoimmune disease, when this is developed in an individual, there are many reasons and many risk factors and many years of things that have happened to result in this misguided immune response. So it's not going to be do this one thing, eat this one food. Like, oh, if you have mushrooms, you won't have an autoimmune disease. Like, no, it's layered, it's many things over a period of time. And so, as I was saying, when I like to work with clients, it's layered and we take things slowly and we do it over a period of time because they didn't develop this disease overnight. It developed over a period of time. It's most likely going to take a period of time for us to, start to see a decrease in symptoms, start to see their microbiome shift, start to see, their intestinal health increase and improve. Um, and for people with autoimmune disease, seeing a reduction in symptoms and seeing improvement in quality of life is huge, like huge. They don't care that they don't have, remission on their blood markers if they're able to function in life and not have
Yeah.
pain, right? And be able to exist and move through the world like a quote unquote normal person or like they did prior to their diagnosis. That is the most impactful and important usually takeaway for those individuals. It's not that, their blood markers have changed. Like that's nice as well. Like, but if they still can't live and move through the world, like I can speak for myself, when I got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, my blood markers were great. Everything was fine. Right. So that a lot of the doctors that I was going to were like, we don't have anything for you. You look fine. Like all your blood is fine, you don't have, XYZ, and that's it. And I was like, okay, but I can't function. I can't get off the couch. I can't interact with the normal world. So uh, that doesn't make sense to me. Right. So a
Mhm.
lot of the times for this diagnosis in this group of individuals and clients, it's a lot about managing symptoms, decreasing symptoms significantly. So when we're looking at the difference between something like a high fiber diet and a fermented food, they're both beneficial. Like, let's see if we can do both.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a really good point too about the temporal aspect of this. We don't develop a chronic disease overnight. It's something it's months of sedentary lifestyle or if not years and months to years of eating this sad diet. So that makes sense. I think we're in medicine, we're so I think used to this magic bullet immediate result that when we try to try to make an intervention in our lifestyle change, we for some reason think, oh, well, it's going to be an automatic change, just like if I pop that pill. But it's not. I mean, how long do you counsel patients to kind of be stick with it and just be confident and patient and keep at it? How long does it usually take in your experience for them to start to feel some relief from symptoms?
So this will be an unsatisfying answer, but everyone is different.
Yeah, of course, of
Um,
course. Yeah.
and a lot of that has to do with, like we talked about before, like the unique nature of each microbiome, right? And each individual and what they're able to do within their own lifestyle. Um, some people have more support than other people. Some people have more financial means than other people. So it all depends. But on the other side of the flip side of that coin, sometimes it's immediate, meaning
Mhm.
sometimes you can very clearly see okay, let's get you on a whole foods diet, right? Let's decrease the highly processed, ultra processed foods that you're eating. And they do see pretty immediate symptom relief. Does that mean they're like completely healed within a meal? No, but it means that the needle is moving in the right direction, you know? And again, for some people, the GI damage is quite substantial. So it takes longer to figure out, the underlying
Yeah.
cause and to really work on healing their GI. And sometimes that's complicated because we have to keep eating food, right? So the GI is still constantly being used and exposed and worked during that period of time that we're trying to heal it. It's not like, when you sprain an ankle and they're like, oh, rest and ice. Like
Mm,
GI has to keep working while we are doing work to help heal. So it's a little bit, sensitive or finicky work, I could say in that way. And that's why like a lot of my work is focused on like looking at the individual, making sure I'm really listening to them and looking at their specific symptoms. Because while we can make a blanket statement and say beans are great, if I just tell someone to eat beans and they can't tolerate them, that's not a helpful resolve, right?
yeah.
That puts them back 10 steps instead of moving them forward. Are smoothies good? Yeah. Is juice good? Yeah. Are legumes and beans good? Yeah. Can everyone have those things? No.
No. Yeah. That's
Not
that's what
today,
makes it
right?
that's I think that's what makes it so incredibly tricky. Um, but at the same time, I think that there is a path forward, and I think there's also a path towards doing this affordably. I will say right now, grocery prices are extremely high. Um, and you can have some sticker shock at the store when you're going to buy produce. But again, um, I think by looking to these different sources of fruits and vegetables, looking to the local farmers markets, you're going to have fresher foods that are more packed with nutrition than something that's been shipped across the globe. Um, your fresh frozen fruits and vegetables. I think the other thing when we were talking about fermented products too, is that we can get out of this mindset of needing to purchase these value added products because it is the easiest art form in the world to ferment vegetables or to make your own yogurt. If you learned how to make yogurt, you can basically buy one more jar of yogurt and that's it for the rest of your life because you will forever have an ongoing culture
Yeah.
of yogurt, right? Um, so I think there are ways to do this affordably. Do you have any tips that you could offer? I'm sure you get many different types of clients and have different types of budgets. Like, how do we eat better for our gut health, and is that even accessible to the average person today?
Okay. It depends. Yes, it's accessible. There's certainly workarounds. I think one of the things that you're saying, I just wanted to comment on as far as, making our own fermented foods, making our own sauerkraut, our own kimchi, our own yogurts. As far as, just pointing back to what we were talking before, a lot of this knowledge is lost, right? A lot of this sort of cultural heritage of how we're making fermented foods, we haven't learned how to do anymore. Those foods weren't prioritized. Foods that were prioritized were, as you said, foods that were marketed to us that we could very easily buy so that we could work longer hours and we didn't have to be at home making foods, etc. So that's just a little, you know, there is a learning curve when learning how to make fermented foods. It is not um, intellectually challenging to make these fermented foods, but it is time consuming and there is a learning curve. There's also other things to get over, like how we have learned to be terrified of bacteria, how we have learned to be really like a lot of fear mongering around tinkering in the kitchen and trying to figure it out on your own. So
Mhm.
some of those hurdles, we would work through over a course of working with a particular client. But as far as like making it affordable, yes, there are increases in food. Once you cut out the processed food, it's not really that comparable. Meaning, the whole of the grocery cart is some produce for most people, right? Some meats, some cheese, some dairy, um, and a lot of processed food, a lot of things that are coming in packages. And I'm not talking about frozen food. Frozen food I would still consider like a
Yeah.
whole food, but processed foods. So if you literally just take all of that out of the grocery cart and put in more whole foods, the cost isn't that um, different, right? It's not that um, steep of a change. But as you said, you can shop at farmers markets. Some farmers markets will accept things like SNAP benefits. You can certainly work with your local farmers depending on what type of a community you live in. You can trade, you can volunteer at farms to get food for free. Like there are different things you can do to be creative about getting the grocery bill down a little bit. People do different co-ops, right? Where your co-ops are a great thing as far as looking at diversity. I know this is a thing that a lot of people did during COVID as well, was they like opted into their local farmers market and got into different co-ops. So every week they were getting just whatever was seasonable and what was seasonal and what was being produced at the farm. So that, as far as like microbial health and GI health, is huge because you're getting a diversity of plants every week. You're not getting the same plant every week. You're having to learn how to make a new food out of a new vegetable that's coming in. Um, and usually it's cost effective. But again, it depends. Are these clients coming in work? Do they live in an urban area? Do they live in a remote area? Do they live in a food desert? Do they have
Yeah.
access to those types of things? I don't know. There's also community gardens. I mean, people can get involved in community gardens, and there's a lot of trading that goes on in community gardens where somebody's got an abundance of tomatoes and somebody else has an abundance of cucumbers and they just swap, right? So there's a lot of ways to be creative about it. It all depends on like what is accessible to each individual. Um, but I think for the majority, if we're thinking about like the majority of Americans or a generalized view of Americans on the SAD standard American diet, if we literally just scoop out all the processed food and put in more produce, the price point is not going to be that different.
Yeah. Well, I'd imagine too, especially if you're including whole grains and beans as a big source of that protein and fiber, it's definitely going to bring down those prices. Amazing. I could speak with you for hours more,
Yeah.
but we are out of time. I want to thank you, Morgan, for coming on the show and for sharing this beautiful illustration of what's going on in our gut and how we can take some small but actionable steps each day to improve our gut health.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk. And hopefully, I'll be working with some people that have listened to this soon. And don't feel afraid to reach out. I think, it's always encouraging to have a provider that really listens to you and wants to know what your story is and everything. So if you're interested in kind of working together and looking towards more of those personalized interventions, it's definitely something that we can work towards.
Awesome. And where can they find you online, Morgan? What's your website?
Yeah, so my website is wellbiomehealth.com and they can reach out to me through there or they can reach out to me on Instagram. Instagram is just at wellbiome, WELLBIOME. Send me a DM, send me a message, follow, whatever. I'm pretty quick to respond to people. So that's the best way to reach me.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Morgan. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Again, we are in season 6. We're in the fall half of our season 6. I want to thank you for tuning in each week. I want to also thank our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for putting on a great show for you. And thanks to you, our listeners. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.